This is Netherguild. It's a game I've been developing since 2018. But how did it start? And why has it been in development for so long? In this video, I'm going to share with you the story of Netherguild's development all the way to the present day, including many ups and downs as well as some useful takeaways. Let's set the scene. It's 2018 and I just finished a long freelance gig, so I was searching for the next thing I'm going to do. As I was job searching, I figured I might as well work on a fun little side project. Back then, it was called Deeper Down. It was a strategy game about leading and managing an expedition to the underground depths of a fantasy world, with some inspiration from Darkest Dungeon. Early on, the game had grid-based movement, turn-based combat, and it looked like this. But that's okay, because it was just a simple prototype back then. Over the next few months, I improved it further in my spare time, but I just couldn't find a good art style. The main art style I knew back then was 2D vector graphics, and I tried various designs for the characters in Netherguild, but despite trying to animate these characters, nothing really worked. When I tried 2D bone animation, it took me a week to get a half-decent walk cycle, if you can call it that. Luckily, however, I came across voxel art and I quickly fell in love with it. It was relatively easy to create assets that look good, and using a Unity plugin, I could easily animate them in Engine. Here's some animations from the game too. I love animating, it's honestly one of my favorite things in game development. Another big breakthrough was the idea of adding height to tiles, so the ground isn't completely flat. This was added thanks to a friend of mine who insisted that I should watch the show Made in Abyss, because it explores some similar themes of venturing underground. In the anime, characters explore the Abyss, which is a massive pit full of danger as well as various treasure and relics of a forgotten civilization. Inside the Abyss, going up can cause people to suffer health issues, and even death, which makes traversing it even more dangerous and interesting. This made me realize that adding a third dimension to a space really makes it far more interesting to travel through than flat terrain, and thus, after some coding, tiles didn't share the same height anymore. Continuing development throughout the next few months, I fleshed out the game in Engine, making the first area, nicknamed the Bluestone Mines, more lively and challenging week after week. By the end of that summer, I released a small demo, and over time players played it and gave me useful feedback which improved the game. If there's one takeaway I want you to get from this video, it's to have playtesters try out your games. The earlier, the better. It's really helpful. Here's just one example from Netherguild's history. Early on, to move your party, you had to move each character separately. So you'd move a character, end turn, move another character, end turn, etc. You can imagine how this became tedious very quickly. But only later in development, I added a player-requested feature for characters following each other. So with one click, you'd have a column of characters going to the tile you picked. This made the game way less tedious and a lot more fun to play. Frankly, these first 2 years of development for every project are the toughest. They're full of self-doubt, worry, and thoughts like, why am I even making this game? And nobody is going to play it anyway. Like, what am I even doing with my life? But this becomes easier with time for multiple reasons. The first reason is that development becomes more of a habit, and you just get used to putting in the work day after day. The second reason is that you get used to living with uncertainty, and not knowing how the game will perform on release. The third reason is that over time, it shapes up into something that feels more like a real game, and as more players play it, some of those worries subside. Braving these doubts, it took me multiple years afterwards to set up a lot of things, like many systems, gameplay polish, and workflow. I also redid the interface multiple times over. I honestly struggle a lot with the game's UI design, so even if the game UI isn't amazing right now, it's still much better than it used to be. Eventually, I wanted to release Netherguild on Steam. I was planning on an early access release because I knew that this is a very content-heavy game, and if I'm planning to release it someday, I'd prefer to get feedback on it throughout development from players rather than working on it completely alone. Little did I know that the journey that followed would be as unpredictable as it was challenging. This next part is the tale of how, despite not having a publisher, I managed to hit 9,100 wishlists on release day, and how despite it all, the game's early access release ultimately failed. But first, I needed to have a Steam page, so I started setting it up with the game's info and hired a talented artist for the cover art. I remember that the process of finding an artist and the back and forth for the capsule art ended up taking about a month. I also made a fancy opening cutscene around that time, which took a month too, though I polished it during multiple months after. Since I had no clue about camera angles, I eventually decided to make the cutscene isometric as well, just like the rest of the game, which honestly helped me a lot. Afterwards, I released the demo on Steam too. Here's a tale of how having a Steam demo helped. I remember that there was one week when I was thinking, this week I'm going to focus on just developing the game. However, fate had other plans, and one evening when I was grinding on the game, my in-game feedback notification system suddenly started filling up with player reports. I rushed to check where all of these players are coming from and discovered that Splattercat, who is a well-known indie game YouTuber, has played my game. Apparently, a player in his Discord has recommended it, and it was one of the biggest spikes in wishlists I got back then. My plan back in those days was this. The first step was participating in the Steam Next Fest. The second step was participating in the Tiny Teams Festival. Afterwards, I wanted to add all of the content for the early access release, and the final step would be to release Netherguild on Steam. However, not everything would go according to plan. In fact, some things were about to go very wrong. But at this point, not all was bad. I did the Next Fest, and it was awesome watching some streamers check out my game, getting some great feedback from players and collecting wishlists. But Netherguild didn't get accepted to Tiny Teams Festival. It was more or less stuck at around 3,000 wishlists. I was grinding on the new areas and making some great progress. For example, I added this awesome feature that lets you push enemies off a cliff to the floor below.
This is Sparta!
However, progress wasn't fast enough, so release would have to be delayed once more. Then, something unlikely happened. I sent my game up to a random strategy game Steam festival called Tacticon, expecting nothing. However, over the course of a few days, I got a couple thousand wishlists. This is because Steam featured that festival on its front page, meaning anybody who browsed Steam that day could find my game among others if they just clicked on the festival icon. The moral of this part of the story is that festivals on Steam are extremely useful. You can never know when they might get Steam featuring, which gives you a lot of sales or wishlists. Afterwards, Netherguild ended up getting another delay. I was an even worse planner back then, so it is what it is. But finally, I decided to release the game on March 2023. I set up the trailer and worked with my game's composer. For both of us, it was our first time working on this kind of trailer, trying to combine the music with specific footage and synchronizing everything, so we both went a tiny bit mad in the process, but I'm rather happy with how the trailer turned out. I released the trailer on YouTube and wrote a press release, sending it to a couple gaming news sites, not really expecting anything. However, somehow over the weekend, my game was getting a lot of traffic from East Asia for some reason. Apparently, it was covered in a bunch of gaming news sites in Japan and Taiwan, which resulted in about 500,000 wishlists. This was a really welcome surprise. Another lucky thing that happened was that in the Spring Festival, in the first half of March, Netherguild was featured in the bottom of the festival page, since it was one of the games to be released that month with a decent number of wishlists. With all of this combined and the popular upcoming list in the days before launch, Netherguild had gotten about 40% of its overall wishlist before early access release during March. In the days approaching early access, I also sent emails to about 40 press outlets and 70 streamers/YouTubers. Honestly, in those days right before early access release, I was a nervous, tired wreck. I also had a bunch of nasty last-second bugs to fix. The highlight of this was when a player found an especially bad save-related bug, and luckily I fixed it the day before release. However, I didn't notice that the fix also broke the entire freaking game. So the day before release, a well-known indie roguelike YouTuber sent me a DM that the game was broken, which was very kind of them, and pretty embarrassing for me. I had to quickly issue a fix and apologize. Early access release day. I had a list of things to do, like emailing press, sending a tweet, etc. This turned out to be really handy, since I didn't have to think on the day of release. I'll just have to follow my simple steps and pre-planned actions. I released the game earlier in the day for me on a Monday, with the logic that I'd have things generally fixed until the weekend if players encountered any issues. And encounter issues they did. The game had a lot of bugs that me and my playtesters missed. Well, it's less true to say that we missed them as much as they weren't as pressing compared to some other stuff, or frequent for that matter. However, 400 players will still find way more bugs than a handful of people ever will, so I had a lot of fixing to do during release week and afterwards. I also tried to avoid checking the sales on release day, but I did check them afterwards. For this part, I just want to clarify that I didn't have super high expectations. I didn't expect the game to suddenly turn into a hit. I thought the game would sell a certain amount based on the number of wishlists and averages from other games, expecting something like 10% of wishlists converting to sales. However, I ended up disappointed. Less than 5% of my wishlists converted to sales, and I was panicking. I felt like the sky was falling around me. Like, I spent the last 5 years of my life on this game only for it to amount to nothing. For 2 to 3 days, I was in some kind of self-inflicted mental hell while I was bug fixing. Eventually, however, I ended up finding a lot of inner strength through it. I made peace with reality, I locked in, and continued bug fixing. Some of those bug fixes actually ended up causing their own issues, and maybe you can see a bit of a pattern here. Like an issue where passive effects were broken on the first weekend due to another fix. This experience taught me to always playtest thoroughly after a change in the game, before I make the changes public, so that I'm more likely to catch any possible errors and crashes. Eventually, Netherguild got to 10 reviews, and I set up my legal entity here and got my first paycheck from Valve, which is a big milestone for any developer. So, what went wrong? I think some of the factors that contributed to the issues with the release were these. First of all, there were release delays due to poor planning on my part. The second factor is a lack of localization. It's a very text-heavy game in early access, so adding localization would have been too much. However, this meant that some of the gamers who wishlisted Netherguild from East Asia maybe wouldn't have been able to play it. That being said, I did get one amazing review from a really kind Japanese player who loved the game despite not being able to read its English text. Another issue with the release was having a buggy demo. It was tough for me to maintain both the demo and the main game, so the demo was buggy, which might have left a poor impression. Poor timing was also a very big issue. I released Netherguild next to another indie roguelike which got more coverage. Also at the end of a month and on a Monday, and after a seasonal sale, which might have meant that people had less money to spend on random games. Netherguild also had more bugs on release week than I anticipated, which might have disappointed players and led to more returns and less purchases. Netherguild also suffers from poor user interface, which just kind of feels unwelcoming, I guess, to new players and makes the game feel less polished. Netherguild was also just too incomplete content-wise back then. I think for a lot of devs, suffering a setback like this can be pretty devastating. And I've seen multiple posts after failed releases where devs blame the entire industry. And the truth is, I kinda get where they're coming from, because taking all the blame onto yourself can be very rough. Self-blame and such is something that I've struggled with a lot these 2 years since release, though I'm doing far better now. While I do kind of feel like I messed up the launch and how it could have went better, releasing Netherguild on Steam Early Access was a massive milestone in and of itself. And ultimately, I've gained a lot of experience from developing Netherguild, which I'll carry over to future games. But I don't want to sound too much like a downer, because the game did resonate with some players, which is part of why it has very positive reviews as of now. Also, all of this wasn't enough to make me give up. I'm determined to finish the game, so I kept working on it over time. A few months afterwards, I improved how the game looked with better post-processing and improved various systems like how combat encounters worked. Towards the end of 2024, I also released a massive update with new areas and classes, leading to more build combinations, abilities, loot, and challenges. As well as a smaller update afterwards, which adds powerful unique abilities at the end of each character's skill tree. Currently, I'm also working on a new jungle area with its own loot and enemies, as well as other subclasses for the new classes to add even more variety and content to the game. Of course, even with the additions and improvements over the years, Netherguild hasn't magically gotten picked up by streamers or the Steam algorithm, Which makes sense, because while the game is way less buggy as of now, it still suffers from some issues, like the not amazing UI, and it's still not fully released. This is why over the years that I've been developing Netherguild, I've also been practicing more game dev, participating in the occasional game jam, and studying pixel art. There's other games I want to make too. I'm not done after just making one game, even if it will take me a few more years before it's fully released. Enter Heroes Against Time, which is a new game I plan to release sometime this year. It's a shorter run-based roguelike, where you draft allies, encounter events, and fight your way through a strange forest while you're trying to avoid a magical creeping fog. The story of Netherguild is still far from over, since it will take me a few more years before it's fully released. However, this is its story so far. I learned a lot during development, and I hope that you discovered something valuable in this video too. If you enjoyed watching, please consider subscribing, giving it a like, and checking out the links in the description to buy or wishlist my games. Your support means the world to me. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.